Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly chats. Thanks again for joining us, either live or later. Later is great too. Um, this week's topic, well, first off, thanks for supporting this. I'm getting more and more people commenting and watching, even if it's just for part of it. That's great. Um, but if you want to make sure you're getting the notifications and the topics we're going to discuss and want to comment, make sure you're liking or following this page, Robert Lowell Goller page, my professional page, and then you'll be sure to get all the topic ideas. I try to send them out Sunday night. That's more for me because so that I don't forget and then I don't wait till the last minute to try to figure out what to talk about. Because sometimes it's easy because I'll be working on a topic or something will come to mind, and other times it's not so easy. So I do try to have a topic, but if you have a better one, or you want to hear about a particular topic, even in between, like if I announce a topic and we have time to talk about something else, that's okay too. So this is, again, really informal, and that's how I wanted it. And I just like taking a break from my day of research and writing to talk about what I might be working on or local history topics that come up, and it's a little less formal than the writing projects that I do. So today's topic is actually coming out of ideas that come from the people I talk to. And there are a couple topics that keep coming up over and over and over again in the history of East Aurora, either through my job as historian or just if I'm in the grocery store or around town. And this one is really neat. And I was going to wait until the summer because it's a summer topic. The circus, the traveling circuits. They wouldn't have traveled during the winter. And I thought, oh, this might be a neat topic for the summertime. But then as I was thinking about this weather, I'm okay talking about summertime right now. This is the coldest week of the year, usually the last week of January, and I get I'm not a winter fan. I enjoy summer very much. So let's talk about summer a bit. Now, this story comes about from a local legend. And it's actually a true story that over time, and we talked about this in previous weeks, of how history gets kind of twisted and turned, and then something that never happened, or there's a grain of truth, gets twisted over the time, and all of a sudden you have a completely different story. And this is one of those stories, and it's an intriguing story because it's based on the traveling circus that came through East Aurora and many small towns across the United States in the late 1800s, particularly the late 1800s. They were around other times too, but after the Civil War, and they would come around to each community, and we'll talk a little bit about that. This story has gotten twisted and turned over time, and it's turned into a local legend, even though it's based on fact. I've posted in the comments the link, and sorry it's so long, but to the article that I wrote about George C. Gordon, who is the circus man, we call him. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about what's in that, but you can read, of course. So if you want to read the article as well, feel free to do that. We get so many questions about this story that I posted it on the town historian's website, the article that I wrote about Mr. Gordon, so people can read about it. But essentially, for years, I had heard, and many people in East Aurora have heard, and several times every year, I get asked about the circus man. Well, actually, someone said a lot of people want to go to Oakwood Cemetery and find the gravestone of the clown. And he's not a clown. We'll talk about that in a bit. Sorry to spoil alert to the end of our discussion here, but this legend had built over time, and so there is a tombstone in Oakwood Cemetery that is in the shape of a circus tent. And that in itself has led to a lot of legends and questions in East Aurora about this intriguing circus tent gravestone that's in the old section of Oakwood Cemetery. In the article, before we move on, in the article that I posted there, I put directions of how to find the gravestone, because it is kind of hard to find because the circus tent imagery is facing away from the driveway toward the creek. So it's easy to miss. And of course, unfortunately, over time, the stone has worn down a bit. So again, it's not as easy to see. So I put and I would have trouble finding it in the cemetery each time I went, and I went quite a bit, and visited a couple times. Each time I go there, I like to just pop by and see and pay my respects. Um, I would have trouble finding it. So finally one day I'm like, I'm writing down how I got here, and then I'll share it. So that's in the article. But so the story was, and this is the story that's been passed down from generation to generation, is that in 1872 there was a traveling circus coming through East Aurora, and the story was that a performer, a clown, and or stunt person, an acrobat, was riding on a horse during a performance under the big top tent, and fell off the horse and died, and suffered injuries from that accident, and died. And that the a local plot in the cemetery, Oakwood Cemetery, was donated by a local family, a space in Oakwood Cemetery, and then the circus company that that was bringing the circus around to East Aurora eventually donated the stone that is in the shape of the circus tent, and it's in honor of this clown slash acrobat that died during a performance under the big top. The story is partly true. I discovered, and of course there's been different, part of the intrigue was, number one, people were asking a lot about it. I had visited the stone. We had some photographs of the gravestone, and Girl Scouts troops would go visit quite often. So it's just an intriguing story, and I wanted to get to the bottom of it. And I had seen dueling explanations of who Mr. Gordon was. We knew when he died. We had the documentation of that. We knew he was part of the circus, but other than that, the only thing we had was this local legend that he was a performer and fell off a horse. There was no horse involved in his passing. In fact, I discovered by doing a little digging in archives that he was a tent worker. He was erecting the tent before the circus, when they came to town, and he suffered a heart attack. He wasn't feeling well, and he went outside to the tent, and he suffered a heart attack and passed away. Unrelated to a performance, but he was probably overexerted himself. The coroner actually determined that it was heart disease, a heart attack essentially, and that he died of that. The rest of the story that has been told is true. A local family that had a plot in Oakwood Cemetery, I believe donated. That there was a purchase of it, but the lot, and they buried him in Oakwood Cemetery, and that the circus company that he employed him erected a stone in the shape of the circus tent, and it was the great. Let me make sure I get this right. It was the Great Central Park Menagerie and Circus, and a Mr. Barnum, who is a relative of the Barnum and Bailey Circus, not the same circus, was the one who arranged all of this. And what happened is, and this is confirmed by news reports, is that the circus went on. They went on to their other towns after Mr. Gordon passed away. But one circus woman stayed back, one employee, and she encouraged she actually asked, she was concerned that Mr. Gordon wouldn't have anybody at his funeral, at his burial in Oakwood Cemetery, so he invited the students, the children from the school, the one-room schoolhouse, which is over at the corner of Douglas Lane and Hamburg Street. The building is still there today. She invited them to come over and pay their respects, and so and of course, being a circus person, an employee of the circus, the children had a connection to that, and we'll talk about circuses in a bit. She invited them to come over. She talked a little bit from the accounts that we have about Mr. Gordon and the circus, and invited those school children to every Memorial Day bring flowers to place on his grave, and they did. So and this was 1872, so for probably 40 or 50 more years, those same children were coming, or at least some of them were coming to Oakwood Cemetery and placing flowers on the grave. As those children grew up and died, that tradition has waned. I do know a couple people who have put with the articles that I've written and the publicity we've given Mr. Gordon, have placed simple flowers on his grave in recent Memorial Days. But so that part is true. And Mr. Barnum from the Circus Company sent a letter to actually Mr. Barnum didn't. Another official sent a letter to East Aurora essentially, and wrote it to someone here in East Aurora, and and it has this ornate letterhead, and you can see it in the article, so I don't have to go into detail about it. And it's handwritten, and he basically thanks everybody in East Aurora for their kindness toward their circus employee. So this nugget of truth got changed over the years from a tent employee to the circus performer on a horse, and that story might be more intriguing, that someone died of an accident than a heart attack. But what I find fascinating is that it didn't matter to East Aurorans and the children, and even his employer, the circus, that they rallied around him in his death and provided him a place for eternal rest and a proper headstone. And one of the things and again, we'll talk a little bit about the nature of circuses, but part of that is Mr. Gordon didn't have family here. He had a distant relative far away, but he didn't, and one of the reasons he may have joined the circus is he didn't have any family, close family. So the circus was his family, and so when he died, in basically a place he had never been before, he wasn't from East Aurora. What do you do? And this happened in circuses and traveling shows, not more often than we might give credit to. But what happens when you are in a town you've never been before and something happens and you pass away? And so this was a great story of East Aurora stepping up, and him, the school children coming to pay their last respects. The circus actually, when they came back through town another time, came and visited him. That account was in the newspapers as well. So I just found, and I like to say that, he didn't have a permanent home, and so he passed away here, and he's become an East Auroran because of just the way we've embraced his story and embraced him. And so he's an East Auroran even though he never lived here, because he's buried in our cemetery, and he helped entertain and bring that entertainment to East Aurora. So for years the story was wrong, and the legend had happened, and but to be fair, and it got published actually in articles because so often there'd be an article published in the newspaper or in a book, and they would repeat the story about the horse. And the acrobat who died during the performance. But to find out the truth, to be honest, in the past, we talked about this before, only in the past 15 years or so have we had digital newspaper archives. I was able to confirm the story that it was a tent worker, that Mr. Gordon was a raiser of the tents, which was a tough job. I was only able to confirm it through the digital newspaper archives. There were Buffalo newspapers that had it, and of course there are other towns where the circus came that I was able to get some background. Previous historians, people before 20 years ago, would have had to actually go to the archives or go look through the actual newspapers, and they weren't searchable. So some of these things that we're finding out, and you can find out if you're doing family research or research into any history, we just weren't able to find out before. So that's what's changed, and that's why the digital archives are quite important, because we are able to tell the story and deal with some of these myths and legends that have occurred over the years. I didn't have to physically go to the archive to look at the newspaper. So read that article about all the nitty-gritty about the sourcing that I used. There's actually a picture of the letter that's in the archives of the historian's office, and a picture of the Girl Scouts who gathered around the tombstone. And actually in that picture you can see a better version of that great circus tent picture. So read that for all the nitty gritty. But what I want to talk about too is about the circuses. And this was a time period, and it's intriguing to me how the circus played a role in local small towns like East Aurora. Now, the circus grounds were at Parkdale, where Parkdale Elementary School is today, which is kind of neat. And I always, if I'm asked to speak to local kids at either the summer camp that's at Hamlin Park, I do tours there, and I talk about Mr. Gordon, and I tell them, that where you go to school is where they set up these giant tents. And this was a big deal. And I was thinking about this as we were preparing, as I was preparing to talk about this today, is how the circus was like a really exciting thing for a local town. The fairs, the circuses, the carnivals they would have. And today we get excited about events like that, but I don't think we would have as much as they did. And just picture it. So what happened on Sunday? Even though the game didn't end as how we wanted here in Buffalo, we all gathered around our televisions, or we went to the stadium to watch the Buffalo Bills play. And we watched it through TV. And there are a lot of things that we watch. We are entertained, or our brains are stimulated for entertainment purposes by television. Or we may go to a show. And there's a lot of pizzazz today. There's a lot of flashing lights and things like that. They didn't have that back in the 1800s, the late 1800s. So a circus would have been a huge deal. And imagine the circus rolling into town, and that's what they literally did. They had a series of, like a caravan of wagons, and they would roll into town. And in East Aurora's case, they'd roll over to where Parkdale Elementary School is today, and they'd start setting up the big top tent, and people would go watch, and then you would buy tickets to go to the show, and there was a lot of buzz about it, and you got to see these people who you would never have seen before, the acrobats, animals. Today we see this all on television, but imagine if you are a child, an adult even, in little old East Aurora, who had never seen an animal besides a dog or a cat, or an acrobat or something. They didn't have television, and so that perspective of no television and how stimulating to the brain a circus would have been coming into town. So these traveling circuses were quite popular because a lot of people couldn't go to an entertainment. Like, we can go to Shays downtown, we can go to the stadium and watch a Bills game, or we just pop the television on. These folks who were living in East Aurora may have been able to go downtown, but to see a show or a live performance. Of course, movies weren't there yet either. This was before the 1920s when movie theaters started popping up. So we had no motion pictures. We had an opera house come a little later, but at that time period there would not have been the kind of entertainment. It would have been quite, by today's standards, primitive. So when a circus came to town, it was a huge, huge deal. And so these companies that had circuses knew this, and they started branding this way of entertainment, and they would bring the circus to these little towns. So you wouldn't go to a big venue and see a show. You wouldn't go to a big theater downtown. The circus would come to you, which was quite fascinating. And this would happen in the summer, and actually Mr. Gordon's incident and passing occurred in June of 1972. And it would happen in the summer, and these circuses would travel from town to town. And this was a tough job. So you would, and you hear that story a lot about people who would run away with the circus if they didn't like their family. A kid would be like, well, I'm going to run away to the circus. I don't want to live here anymore. I don't want to deal with my parents anymore. Well, there's some truth to that statement. People actually did. And people like Mr. Gordon, who may not have had a family, that circus was their family and they would travel around. But they didn't have a permanent home. And in this case, they would live out of tents, essentially, or wagons, and the circus people would come to town, and they would be a little eccentric, a lot of them. And sometimes and I think Mr. Gordon's story is a perfect example of how much overhead there would have been for circuses, how many people were involved with circuses. When we think of a traveling circus, the first thing we kind of usually think of is the clowns, the acrobats, the performers, the lion tamer, things like that. But there's a whole host of people behind the scenes, including Mr. Gordon, George Gordon, setting up the tents, doing all the maintenance on the wagons, things like that. There would have been a lot of background people who were making sure everything ran properly. So there were a lot of people to hire. And so a lot of people would be coming into town. And it would be quite exciting. So these folks were employed by the circus company and would come and entertain. And again, it would be a really big deal. So just imagine that. And I just as we think about these traveling circuses, like if a circus were to come to town today, it would be a big deal. But it was totally different back in the 1880s and 1870s. Because it was a very unique entertainment for people who didn't have television, radio, or the internet, or things that we take for granted today. So when we think about the traveling circus, think of that. Again, with Mr. Gordon, I think the lesson with him is that the circus became the family, and sometimes we say that, and we're hoping that that's the case. But what is great about Mr. Gordon's story is I see that the circus people came back when they traveled through East Aurora again, and I note that in the article, and came to pay their respects. So that just was an indication to me that they really truly were a family. So these circus companies really knew what they were doing. They probably we know they made a lot of money doing what they were doing. And so it was great to see that this circus company didn't just leave Mr. Gordon behind in East Aurora. They made sure that he was taken care of with the stone, and thanking East Aurora for the help. And I think that was an understanding that the circus relied on the audiences that they went around and entertained. So the people of East Aurora stepped up, and I think the circus appreciated that. So the circus did go on. So Mr. Gordon was buried in the cemetery, and the circus went on. So this story is like, I kind of at first was like, oh my gosh, they left him here. But I think they left him in good hands, and I think East Aurora has embraced him, which is wonderful. But finding out the true story of him has opened up a lot of things about traveling circuses that I never even thought of before. And as I was researching his story, and I thought, oh yeah, I mean the circus needs all this background stuff to make it go. And literally, you'll read about this. You'll see this sometimes on TV shows. Little House on the Prairie television show has some historical accuracy issues, but I think one of the episodes they had where a circus came to town, they come in, they do their shows, there's all sorts of excitement, and just as fast as they came in, they're packed up and gone. And so it was it was a burst of excitement in East Aurora, and there would have been a lot of publicity about it, posters around town. One of the things that I'll leave in our discussion about Mr. Gordon that made it more difficult to research him is his death occurred in June of 1872, June of 1872, and our East Aurora Advertiser, the newspaper, didn't start publishing until August of 1872. So there was no local newspaper to rely on to get some background information about it. But the note from the circus company that we still have preserved, coupled with the digital versions of newspapers that we had, help us tell his story. So I am a firm believer that I think people like Mr. Gordon, who provided us a service in East Aurora, and probably didn't make a lot of money doing it. The workers themselves probably didn't make a lot of money, and didn't have a permanent home, and sacrificed quite a bit to bring entertainment to East Aurora. I think it's great that we still talk about him, that I still get the chance to say his name, and that we remember a part of our history that it's been romanticized a little bit because of the legend around Mr. Gordon, but to remember that this was it was a tough job. Circus performers did get hurt, so we have to remember that too. If you got hurt and you were far away from home, or you didn't have a home, and you relied on, you might have been had things happen while you're traveling around. And back then they didn't have the resources that we do today to handle things like that. So it really was a sacrifice. And so to have Mr. Gordon here, I think we have to remember who he was, really who he was, and honor him. And also, and remember what the circus did for entertainment in East Aurora and other small towns in that time period. That there was a purpose to circus life, not only making money for the executives who own the companies, but also entertaining people. It was a very important part of our world then in the 1800s. So again, I invite you to read more about it in there, and if you have any comments about traveling circuses or questions about circuses, I'd love to talk more about it. This wasn't the only circus that came through town, and actually later, I mean, we had traveling circuses. There was one in the 50s and 60s, I believe. There were circuses set up on plots of land around East Aurora. But then when we had Toy Fest in East Aurora, there was also a circus that came for that, and they set up in Hamlin Park. So traveling circuses have been part of our history for a while, and Mr. Gordon is a great example of that part of history. He sort of symbolizes the history of the old circuses. So if you have a chance, I know it's a little snowy out now, but in the spring, to go visit his grave. It really is it's really neat to picture when you're standing there. And I did a video of this, and maybe I'll pop that up too, next to hit the grave. And when you're standing in that location and you look across the creek and see the old schoolhouse where the school children came, and then if you look the other direction, you can kind of imagine how far the circus grounds would have been over by Parkdale School. It kind of gives you an idea of what the world was like then. And what I'm fascinated in many respects about cemeteries is, he's buried there, his stone is there, and cemeteries don't change a whole lot. But the world around the cemetery does. So, Mr. Gordon is there in that cemetery along with a lot of other people who were from East Aurora and built this community. And the Tim Hortons that built up around it, and Oakwood wasn't paved, and all that, and the plaza across the creek, the shopping plaza, that if you're standing there, you can kind of get it sounds a little weird, but you can get a better picture of what it would have been like, and imagine the school children gather around his grave for this wonderful tribute to him. So feel free to go do that. Again, we're running out of time. As always, it seems to go quick. Please feel free to drop any questions or comments. I really love the ideas. Like this idea came out of that, of somebody saying something, and looking forward to chatting about another topic. One of the topics that I did get, and I might bring this up, I might do this next week or in the coming weeks, let me know what you think, is some folks have asked why we have a town historian and a village historian. New York State's quite unique in this requirement to have an official government historian, a government official. So and why we have them, and what their job is supposed to be. So that might be a topic coming up. But give me more ideas. I'd love to hear more. So thanks again for joining us. And if you have any questions about Mr. Gordon or the circus, pop it in the comments. See you next time.